Hello and welcome to Non-Inkables. This is part 2 of the TCG Terms video series. I've learned a lot more new terms and I would like to share them with you. And these terms mostly come from, I would say, just listening to other people's podcasts and things and then playing with people who have played TCGs for a long time. They'll say stuff and I have no shame. So I'm just like, what does that mean? Is it English? What are you talking about? Or I'll just look it up. So we'll start with terms that are specific to the Bucky errata, since that's talk of the town. So you may see videos that say things like nerfed. Bucky has been nerfed. So what does nerf mean? So it just means to reduce the effectiveness. Nerf means to reduce the effectiveness of. So they basically made Bucky a less effective character. So they made him weaker. They made him cost more. And he doesn't have as good of a special ability. The other term that people often will say when they're talking about playing green steel and playing turn 1 Diablo, turn 2 Bucky, turn 3 shift, or turn 2 Bucky with shift Diablo onto your first Diablo by discarding a song. So essentially discarding people's cards starting on turn 2. They'll refer to that as a nut draw. And I thought that that meant they drew Bucky because Bucky has an acorn, which is a nut. And so I thought nut draw mean like they drew the combo because of Bucky being a squirrel who eats nuts. However, that is actually not why it's called nut draw, and that is not what nut draw means. Nut draw does not mean that you drew Bucky. Nut draw means you have the ideal opening hand. And sometimes people also say like the nut, which means you have a very good draw or very good play, like that was the nut. Yeah, so nut draw means ideal opening hand, which in this case is drawing Bucky, but it could also refer to, say, if you're playing Ruby Amethyst and your nut draw would be like turn 1 Chernobog, turn 2 Flynn, turn 3 Sisu, turn 4 Castle. That would be a nut draw, even though there are no squirrels or nuts involved. Next term is cantrip. So that is a card that can replace itself. And so examples of this would be things like Develop Your Brain. You play Develop Your Brain, but then you still get a card in hand. Popsicle. You play the Popsicle, but then you get another card. And so it's like the Popsicle replaced itself in your hand. And then related to that is slow trip. So slow trip is like a cantrip where you replace the card, but you get the card at a later time. So examples like this would be like Chernobog's Followers. You get the card after you quest. Or like Magic Broom. You get the card after you play another character. You can banish to get a card back. Or like, I feel like the first time Tragic Beast is activated would also be like a slow trip because you played the Tragic Beast, and if it doesn't get damaged the next turn, you do get a draw card, and that would be like a slow trip. An example of a card that has both cantrip and slow trip would be something like Merlin Rabbit. So when you play the card Merlin Rabbit, you get a draw card. So that is the cantrip portion. And then when Merlin Rabbit leaves play, either because you bounced it or because it was banished, you draw another card, and that is the slow trip part. So Merlin Rabbit is both cantrip and slow trip. Another word that I've seen around a lot is chase card. And that is just a valuable rare card that is highly desirable. So a lot of people is like, oh, this is my chase card. So like in terms of our friends who play, there's someone who loves Ariel. So the Enchanted Ariel was her chase card until she got it. And then we have a couple people who really like Elsa and Frozen. And so like the Enchanted Elsa, the Enchanted Anna are their chase cards. The next word is clock. And then this, a lot of times when you watch videos about decks, they'll say like, oh, I'll play this and that'll put them on the clock. Or like this will put them pressure on them because there's a clock. And that just means that they have played a threat that will over time lead to victory, like over a finite number of turns will lead to victory. So examples of this would be things like Spellbook, because you can get 1 lore every turn. Things like Flute, 1 lore every song. Any locations that get lore. And sometimes even like things like Lucky Dime. So essentially it's like these things get you lore, even if, say, you have nobody on the board, you're not questing, they will eventually get you lore and you'll win. And so that is an example of clock. Next is a big thing is called curve. So curve is essentially the distribution of ink cost. And it can be like within the deck. It could be how you play the deck. So just like different applications. So sometimes decks will be described as low curve, and that just means they have a lot of very cheap characters, so like 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop characters. And those are usually more decks that tend to quest very aggressively, so they'll be referred to as aggro decks or hyper aggro decks. So an example would be if they played like a Lilo that quests for 2 but costs 1, a Maleficent that quests for 2 but costs 1. There's that Pinocchio that quests for 3 but costs 2. There's Pooh Pirate Captain Piglet Pooh Pirate Captain, where he quests for 3 if you have more than 2 characters on the board. In Ruby, there's that Simba that also quests for 3. So things like that. If you have a bunch of those characters, then your deck is referred to like as a low curve, because all your ink cost distribution of your characters is low. Then on the opposite end, you have high cost, so a high curve. So you have lots of characters that cost a lot of ink. And that usually happens in ramp decks because they are able to ramp so they can ink faster than a regular deck. And so then they can get to those, like, ramp decks can sometimes have like 16 ink. I think one time I played one of the ramp decks against another ramp deck, and at the end of the game, we both had like 21, 22 ink. So then when you're playing characters that cost 8 ink, it's like nothing. And then ramp decks often, like, especially when they were playing Belle, it takes 13 ink to play Lucky Dime, play Belle, and then activate Lucky Dime on Belle. And that is like 13 ink for any other deck is pretty hard and probably never seen. But for a ramp deck, very common. And then sometimes people will say that you can curve out. And that just means that each time you play, you're utilizing your full ink well. So if you have 1 ink, you are using 1 ink. If you have 4 ink, you use all 4 ink. So no ink is getting unused, and that means you're curving out. Or you're playing your ideal curve. You're playing on the curve, which is like turn 1, 1 ink, turn 2, 2 ink, turn 3, 3 ink. Like you're just efficiently using all of your ink. Another term that you might hear, especially when people talk about preparing for championships or challenges, is the gauntlet. And that just refers to a group of decks that are expected to be in the metagame. So the top decks that you would want to play test against. So currently that would be Emerald Steel, Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, and Sapphire Steel. And then I think Amber Steel is kind of coming up again. So if you play test in a group, those are the decks that you want to practice against, that you need to know how to play against. And that is called like running the gauntlet or testing the gauntlet. You know, you put your deck against the gauntlet and see how you do against the top meta decks, because those are the decks that you're most likely going to encounter. Another word that people often say is hardcast, and that is just paying retail for a song. So in Lorcana, you can either pay ink to play a song, or you can sing it for free, quote unquote free, so you don't pay ink for it. And then when you pay ink for it, that is called hardcasting. So sometimes when you play people, they'll say, I'm going to hardcast Friends on the Other Side, or I'm going to hardcast Be Prepared. And that just means that they're going to pay ink for it instead of having one of their characters sing it. And then another word is hard removal, which means the same thing essentially as direct removal. And that refers to getting rid of a character or putting damage on a character, even though it's not exerted. So in order for one of your characters to challenge one of your opponent's characters, your opponent's character has to be exerted. Otherwise, you can't really touch them with your characters. However, within Lorcana, there are several ways to kind of get around that. And so there's a lot of examples in Steel. So they are kind of like known for their hard removal or direct removal. And they have things like Fire the Cannons, Ba-Boom, a Smash, Along Came Zeus, Strength of a Rainy Fire, Let the Storm Rage On, etc., etc. They have a ton of stuff that can get rid of your characters. And I think this is also something to consider, because if your opponent is playing, say, an evasive character and you don't have any evasive characters, the only way you would be able to get rid of your opponent's evasive character is if you have hard or direct removal. Ruby also has some methods, so Dragonfire, Be King Undisputed, Brawl, Be Prepared. And then Sapphire actually does too, through Let It Go. But those are just examples of ways to get rid of characters, even if they're not exerted. Another term that you'll hear a lot is called if I can say it, it's called inevitability. Inevitability. Oh my goodness, so hard to say. And that just means if the match were to continue on through many, many turns, who is more likely to win? So I think the easiest way to understand this is, say one person is playing a super aggressive deck that quests for a lot with very small characters, and the other person is playing more of a controlled deck that is more long game, has a lot of ways to get rid of characters, then it is inevitable that if the game continues on, that the second person, the person playing the control deck, will ultimately win because they have stronger, more powerful stuff. So the technique of the aggressive deck with the cheap characters would just be to quest a bunch in the beginning and try to like outrace the other person to 20 lore. So before the person who is playing the control deck, the second person, before they can do anything or do anything efficiently, the other person is just questing to try to win. And then people will talk about this a lot in terms of like, I think I've heard it a lot when either the ramp decks play against each other or the ramp deck and Ruby Sapphire play, or Ruby Amethyst plays together, because they'll say like, oh, well, this deck is going to win through inevitability. And so you have to, if you're playing the other deck, you have to win before like the game goes on for too long. And I think that happens a lot also with, I felt that way when I played Emerald Steel in set 3. I felt that if I didn't win early in the game and it got to later game, like there was no way to come back. It was just inevitable that the other person would win. Another term that you may hear is lethal. And so sometimes people say like, I have lethal on board, or that person has lethal on board. And that just means that if you don't do anything to their board on the next turn, they can get to 20 lore. So I think it kind of comes from Magic, where I don't understand Magic that much, but I think that instead of questing in Magic, you just like kill characters. And so lethal in like they can kill all your characters, I guess. Whereas in Lorcana, because it's Disney and family friendly, you're questing. And so if you can get to 20 lore in the next turn, then you have lethal on board. And so they have to get rid of something of yours or else they win. Another term you hear a lot is mirror match. And that just means that you're playing a deck that is very similar to yours. So the two decks in the match are very similar. So it's like playing a mirror. And it's usually refers to decks of the same color combo, but not always. So you could have, for example, in Amber Steel right now, there's like Amber Steel Song, where it has a lot of singers. They sing a lot of songs. It maybe has flutes, maybe has Pride Lands. That's one version. And then there's Amber Steel like Pluto to make things cheaper, plus Gaston to make things cheaper. And then you put like a Chenpo on. And so that's like a totally different version. So even though those two decks are technically both Amber Steel, it would not be a mirror match, you know? So because one is focused on songs and one is totally different, focused on like bodyguards and stuff. And so mirror match usually means it's the same color, but also it should be a similar type of deck as well. Another thing people will say is like, oh, I misplayed. And that just means they made a mistake. Like there was a better play they could have done. And then if you listen to people talk about playing, they will say like play to your outs. And your out is just it's a way for the losing player to get back into the game. So for example, I have a lot of Ruby Amethyst examples because that's what I'm currently playing, but an out for Ruby Amethyst is be prepared because it gets rid of everything. So like if they have like some crazy board that you can't deal with, say they are playing Sapphire and they have like 3 cogs worth given, which has ward and then is giving resist to everybody, pretty much the only way you can get back in is to get rid of all the cogs worth. So play be prepared. Or if you're playing against Green Steel and they have their, 3 Buckies, 2 Diablos, be prepared is the way to get out of that. Or if you play like that big Sisu, that could get rid of the Buckies. And that would be like your out, your way to get back into the game. Another word is playset. So a playset just refers to 4 copies of a card. So if you make a deck, the maximum number of the same type of card you're allowed is 4. And so if you have a full set of 4 cards for that, you have a playset. Another thing that I've seen more because of webcam games is proxies. So when we were all playing Pixelborn, everyone had every card. It didn't matter, right? And you could also get that mod and you could play all enchanted cards for the cards that have enchanteds. But because we're playing now in real life, people may not have all the cards, or they may not have all the cards yet. And so, or they maybe want to test those cards out before they buy them. And so they make what's called a proxy. So that's just a card that represents another card. So I've seen this pretty hilariously. People will like draw their own proxy, and it is usually like a horrible Sharpie picture that has like the ink cost and then this like all the important information, and then has like a vague picture of what the actual picture is. So like they'll have like a lucky diamond. It's literally just like a circle or something. And it says like LD for lucky diamond. Proxies are not legal in competition, but if you're just practicing like at League or with a friend, totally okay. And really funny to see people's proxies. Another word that I've heard a lot is recur or recursion. And that just means you're reusing the same cards to gain an advantage. So I think an example of that would probably be like Rabbit. You could reuse that card and bounce it to continue to get more cards. And so you are recurring. The card is recurring. Next is Rogue Deck. So that is a deck that is not following the trends of a particular meta game, or it's using a deck or strategy that is unorthodox or non-conventional. Those decks sometimes can also be described as homebrews, where basically people make it at home. It's not like one of the ones that has won past competitions and people post online, you just copy it, that kind of thing. An example of this is the winner of the Atlanta Challenge. So for the Atlanta Challenge, everyone thought it was going to be like Ruby Amethyst, and Amber Steel was pretty big, and I feel like Green Steel's always is pretty big, and the ramp decks and stuff, right? And then the person who won was playing Amber Amethyst, and everyone was like, deck. It had like Perdita, it had Fairy Godmother. It's very unexpected and not part of the metagame that was happening. And so that is a rogue deck that was homebrewed. Another word that I've seen a lot now, playing more people, is they will say scoop. And that just means that they concede the game. And so it's because they're scooping their cards off the table. Yeah. And so sometimes you'll see in like Discord and stuff, people will be like, what happens if I'm playing this deck and they do like, what happens if I'm playing Emerald Steel and they play Diablo on 1 and then they play Bucky on 2 and they shift their Diablo and then they sing a sudden chill and I have no cards, and people will say like, oh, just scoop, like just concede at that point. Yeah. And another thing that people talk about is tech cards or tech, and that is basically like using the attributes of like a certain card to improve your deck in the current metagame. So people will often tech for things that they see. So for example, currently Ruby Amethyst is using Crab as a tech card because there's so many mirrors, because there's so many other people playing Ruby Amethyst, and it's difficult to get rid of Queen's Castle because it has 7 willpower and the strongest attacker is Maui and he only has 6, so you would need 2 things. A lot of people are adding in Crab to give that additional strength to deal with Queen's Castle. Other tech cards that you can see, like in the Sapphire decks, a lot of them are now, or Sapphire Steel specifically, a lot of them are playing Rise of the Titans against Queen's Castle, basically. It's like an anti-Queen's Castle card. And usually with tech cards, they'll be like, you won't have a 4 of, it's not like an integral part of the deck. There'll be like 1 or 2, and it's in the deck specifically for a certain situation. The other term you may hear a lot about are tier levels. So people will say like, oh, what is the best deck to play for set championships? And they'll rank them in a tier. And the tiers will usually, sometimes they'll be like 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes they'll be S, A, B, C, D. And if you're new to kind of like this kind of ranking, S is a carryover from video games. So a lot of them were made in Japan, and in Japan they use S to both in advertising and also in academics, and it stands for the word shu, which means exemplary. And so that is like above A. So if you think about like American grades, it's A, B, C, D, where A is the top. But a lot of times when people make tier lists, they just use that Japanese system, and so S is the top. You can remember it like S for super or S for special. And so S becomes the best grade. Another word I've seen a bunch is top decking or top deck mode, which is kind of how I won last set, is I just top deck better than my patient. Top deck specifically refers to when you play the card that you just drew. And so my current deck, Ruby Amethyst, I am pretty good at top decking, be prepared when I need it and when I can actually play it. And then top deck mode refers to when you have no cards in hand, and so the card that you draw is the only card that you can play. Something else that you'll hear a lot about is variance. So that is how different gameplay elements play out from one experience to the next. So basically, like circumstantial factors that are not entirely under the player's control. So basically, they happen because of chance. And so every game is different. So for example, if you're playing Green Steel, every game you're not going to be able to draw your ideal like Diablo turn 1, Bucky turn 2, shift Diablo. Like that, you might not draw every time, you know? And that is due to variance, basically due to chance. Something else that people will talk about is win condition. Sometimes that is shortened to win con, and it's basically the method of how that particular deck wins, is the win condition of that deck. So a hyper-aggressive deck that quests a lot, their win condition is to quest a lot in the beginning. Sapphire decks, their win condition is to Lucky Dime. So they use Lucky Dime on something that quests for a lot, has a lot of lore, like Tamatoa with a bunch of items, and that is how they win. Yeah. Other things you'll hear are OTP. That means on the play. I was confused because if you watched my previous video, we talked about OTK, which is one turn kill. Not related at all. So OTP means on the play. So you could either be on the play, meaning you go first, or on the draw, which means you go second. People sometimes will also talk about board wipe, which just means a card that gets rid of at least all of your opponent's stuff or a bunch of stuff. So like things like B prep can be a board wipe. Well, B prep is definitely a board wipe, but other things that can be like a board wipe would be like that 8-cost Sisu that removes all characters that are like 2 strength or less, like grab your swords, etc. Something else people will talk about that I've seen in videos is threat density, and that just means how many cards in your deck are like things that get rid of your opponent's characters, I suppose. So specifically, I've heard that in terms of the newer Ruby Amethyst deck. So Luca, who won the 10K CCS, his deck that I think he talked to someone named George about. I don't remember. Maybe George is from Forbidden Mountain. I'm not sure. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but they decided to only play 4 1-drops because they thought the 1-drops weren't worth very much. And then they played a higher threat density. So they had more of the stuff at the top, like Be Prepared, Be King Undisputed, Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, also known as the Chair Ladies, which I think is pretty funny. But then that way their deck has more stuff that can control the other person's board. And then the last word I wanted to talk about is tilt. So tilt refers to when you are so frustrated that you start playing badly. Like you get so angry that your emotions take control of you and you're no longer thinking rationally. And so you just start making bad plays because you're pissed. And I think that's kind of funny and something to be avoided. Do not tilt. And I think sometimes they talk about this in terms of like back, especially with Pixelborn, when you could play multiple games in a row. If you like are on a losing streak, you can either kind of regroup and see if you can figure out what you're doing wrong and fix it, or you could get pissed and then just get frustrated and start making bad plays and then continue losing, which is not ideal. So yeah, don't tilt. Try not to tilt. Take a deep breath. It's just a game. Anyways, those are all the terms I have for today. I'm going to cut it off here before it becomes an even longer video. There will be at least a part 3 because there's a lot of other terms that I didn't want to jam into this video. And I'm still like, I still can't believe that I thought nut draw literally meant because he had an acorn and nuts. And so it was drawing Bucky, but it's not. Anyways, as always, check out our TCG store. Keep shuffling. Hopefully you don't end up with a whole handful of non-inkables like me. All right, bye.